Well, the big question on the oil market right now is the death of Venezuela's President Hugo Chavez, which many analysts say may affect oil production in the country. But of course, questions around that. So far, Venezuela has been unaffected by that, but I suppose the news has just been broken. It is the second largest oil reserves in the world. Let's take a look at this and other factors driving the oil market on the day. Christopher Johnson, Energy Community Editor at Thomson Reuters, joining us from London. Christopher, thanks for your time. So Chavez, of course, passing away and known for channeling record oil revenues to the poor. And of course, we know the fuel prices in Venezuela, in fact, some of the lowest in the world. But has this had any effect on the overall oil market? I mean, what's the response been from purely a fundamentals perspective right now?
Well, I think the oil market has a duality really at the moment. It's in the short term, any uncertainty is probably a bullish factor, likely to push up prices. But in the longer term, any real change in production is likely to be perhaps to the upside as a result of the demise of Hugo Chavez. You know, most political analysts are not expecting a huge political change in Venezuela at the moment. Chavez's anointed deputy has a commanding lead in opinion polls. He's probably going to he will face a challenge in the next month or so, but those polls are likely to maintain the status quo. That's to say the current socialist government's likely to be re-elected. So the policies are unlikely to change in the short term. I think going forward, we know from looking at other countries where a strong political leader leaves a legacy, that legacy often doesn't last for an enormously long time, and policies do change. You can never even tell, even with a deputy anointed, you never know whether things are going to remain. I mean, think of Shakespeare's King Lear, for example. Once the leader has gone, then the leader is gone, and policies do change. However, I mean, Venezuela, as you say, I mean, in fact, it might well have the world's biggest reserves. That's disputed at the moment. BP, in its latest estimate, thinks that perhaps Venezuela is sitting on about 300 billion barrels of proven oil reserves. That's a massive amount, well ahead of Saudi Arabia, potentially. Is that going to come? I think the probability is that production is going to increase in the next few years, and possibly production will be accelerated as a result of the change that's happening at the moment.
Yeah, certainly one of the interesting points also around this is, could they potentially change their policy towards foreign investors? What's your sense, or what's the sense right now to this? And as you say, I suppose we really don't know what is in the mind of Maduro, but one can only speculate, I suppose.
I think that's exactly right. One can only speculate. I was speaking this morning to a lawyer who's been advising foreign oil companies in Venezuela in the last few years. His view is that nothing is going to change dramatically in the short term. However, going forward, it is quite possible that investment rules might be loosened, and I think that could lead to greater production. However, as you said at the beginning there, some of the key policies are unlikely to change. It is one of the cheapest places in the world to fill up an SUV, about $2 to fill up your tank in Venezuela. You know, European and most other consumers in the world could only dream of those sorts of prices. I don't think there's any immediate prospect that that's going to change, and obviously that will continue to be a drag on exports because domestic consumption is very high.
Certainly we dream of those oil prices here in South Africa, or fuel prices rather. Fuel prices continue to head higher. What about the overall market right now? Because the oil price has come under a bit of pressure, one might say, given the fact it's trading at the lower end of its range for 2013. What's driving that momentum, I suppose one might call it? It seems to be on the downside, or particularly constrained when it comes to any upside.
Well, I think the fundamentals, I mean, you can look at this in two ways. You can either look at the fundamentals of supply and demand, and at the moment, supply into the world oil market is relatively good. Saudi Arabia produced a lot of oil towards the end of last year. It's since cut back, but the oil market is still very well supplied. Iran, for example, which is under sanctions from the West for its nuclear program, it's actually managing to get more oil into the market than many analysts expected, perhaps somewhere between 1 million and 1.5 million barrels a day. That's more than people anticipated at this time. A number of other OPEC countries are also producing more. Iraq is producing more. And of course Venezuela, as we've been discussing. So the oil market is well supplied. I mean, just to put that in perspective, about 750,000 barrels a day more oil is being produced at the moment by OPEC than the estimated average demand for OPEC oil this half of the year. So that means that stocks are very, very full and they're not being depleted. That is putting a lot of pressure on oil prices. And in the short term, I mean, OK, we've come down a long way. I don't think many analysts out there are forecasting an immediate and sharp rebound.
And we know that it was reported that a Brent crude pipeline was shut off in the UK. Any updates on that?
Well, it looks as if that's coming back on stream fairly shortly, but it has to be said that that news and various other little bits of information, all of which might have been expected to push up prices, has really failed to do so. The last 3 weeks we've seen a fairly steady decline in oil prices, and it does look as if this is being driven probably by speculative oil money that's a lot of the big funds that came in very strongly into oil at the beginning of the year do now seem to have pulled back substantially, and that does affect the price of oil at the front end of the market. That's to say, the front futures, that oil for now. Yeah. Further back, in fact, oil prices are much lower. Instead of $110 a barrel, you can be looking at $95 a barrel or even $90 a barrel if you go far enough forward. Yeah. So overall, the perspective of the market hasn't really changed, but certainly at the moment the pressure is downwards.